My name is Kanti Bajpai, and I'm a professor of international relations at the Kuan School of Public Policy, which is part of the National University of Singapore.
What are the reactions in Southeast Asia to Secretary Blinken's visit to China?
I think in Southeast Asia, the reaction to Blinken's visit to China is one of some relief. It suggests that there are lines of communication open between the two superpowers. Southeast Asia is very concerned about having to make a choice, a strategic choice, between the United States and China. And so this suggests that the two are prepared to reopen channels of communication and hopefully stabilize the military and diplomatic environment in this region, the large region of East Asia, which is important for Southeast Asia as well. So I think, overall, the messaging that's come out of that meeting is that they're trying to resume business within some limits, and that's good for Southeast Asia.
How do Southeast Asian countries want the U.S.-China relationship to progress?
There's cautious optimism, and the caution is that this might be a one-off, the meeting between Blinken and counterparts. When Secretary of Austin was in Singapore for the Shangri-La dialogue, for instance, his Chinese counterpart refused to meet him. So that was almost simultaneous. It was a few days before Blinken went to China. So, there are contrary trends there, obviously. Blinken is welcome in Beijing, but Austin is not welcome to speak to Chinese counterparts here on the sidelines of the Shangri-La dialogue. The Americans want to resume a more business-like relationship, but are continuing to restrict Chinese access to technology. They're stitching up relationships with a whole bunch of allies and partners who are in a position to deliver technologies such as semiconductors and so on to China. So that's another contradiction. Engaging in a dialogue in Beijing at a strategic military level, but then continuing to prosecute the competition at the economic level. And that bears on Southeast Asia, because perhaps in the short term, the problem for Southeast Asians immediately is that supply chains being disrupted because of the competition between the United States and China, and de-risking, decoupling. All of that, has implications for Southeast Asian businesses and economic decision-making. So, Southeast Asians are happy to see the resumption of some dialogue at the big grand strategic level, but they also want to see what's in the mix going forward on the economic relationship between the US and China. In a day-to-day sense, that's more pertinent than, say, a conflagration over Taiwan. And so that's why I say cautious optimism. Great that they're talking to each other, but, the real rubber hits the road on economics here. So let's see how that progresses.
Where does Singapore hope for U.S.-China cooperation?
I think Singapore has been pretty clear where it wants U.S.-China cooperation. Obviously, in the military security realm, one of the nightmares for Singapore and others is a conflict over Taiwan, which would draw the region in, or at least there's the very big fear that it would. Take, for example, the U.S.-Singapore military security relationship. Would the Americans activate it and ask for port facilities or intelligence sharing, or even some kind of naval escort or R&R and repair and maintenance and so on in the instance of a conflict over Taiwan? And if they do ask, what is Singapore going to do, given that it has quite a strong relationship with China? And of course, we have to worry about, in Singapore, about the internal realm as well. I mean, this is a country of 70% or so ethnic Chinese. So, there's a kind of internal political, social factor that the Singapore government would have to take into account. So I think certainly a conflict in Taiwan, that's probably the biggest worry. The South China Sea these days is relatively stable. So I don't think there's such a great worry that there would be a conflict there. And in any case, the Americans are far more agnostic about what they would do in the case of a South China Sea problem. Whereas I think it's pretty clear that they would have to take some military action in the case of a Taiwan invasion or conflict. So I think the first very big problem for Singapore is what do they do in response to American requests over a Taiwan conflict. But the other, and this is again the bread and butter issue, and that's the economics. Supply chain disruption, technology spigots being turned off, technology denials, the pressures coming either from the Chinese side or the American side on whose technology and standards to adopt in, say, internet protocols or 5G and 6G and so on. I mean, these are very real concerns here. The economic issues are very central for all Southeast Asians, but particularly for small Singapore, which must be economically integrated and connected, not just to its regional partners, but to the United States and China particularly. So I think, those are the two areas where Singapore would definitely want some repairing of relationships and a kind of normalization. I think the broader issue for Singapore would be, kind of normalization also of people to people and so on, in the hope that that will condition the overall U.S.-China relationship and not make it awkward for Chinese and Americans to visit each other. They often transit through Singapore, and they have subsidiaries or whatever here, and it just makes it awkward when visas and things become very difficult, and there's a breakdown in say university cooperation. We're right here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. If American academics who work with Singapore counterparts and so on can't go to China, or the reverse, Chinese academics who can't get to America or work in projects where American rules may apply on intellectual sharing or whatever, and all of that makes it awkward for Singapore academics and universities, I think. So, these are at least three areas where I think Singapore would be quite concerned and would want a rapprochement or a easing of tensions.